Chapter 1. I just wanted to grow my hair. That sentence lands like a punchline in the middle of a disaster movie, but it's the honest truth. I wasn't trying to become a cautionary tale. I wasn't plotting a prank or staging an experiment for clicks. I watched one too many late-night videos, clicked on a bright thumbnail promising natural results, and decided, without consulting anyone, that the easy solution was a jar of onion juice. That jar became a thing in our house. It sat on the bathroom shelf like a weird relic, a small glass confession. I would open it at night, squeeze a damp cloth until my fingers steamed of onion, rub it into my scalp with the meticulous care of a man who had been watching his hairline retreat for the last 5 years. I did it with the guilty hope that one jar and a few weeks of midnight rubbing would undo a decade of self-conscious mornings. My wife, Maya, has always been patient about my quirks. She tolerates my taste in music, my stubbornness with directions, the way I talk through movies. But that tolerance has limits. I should have known that. I could see them in her face the morning after the first application. A mix of amusement, disbelief, and then something colder that I didn't want to look at. An embarrassment that pretended to be anger. Quick note for anyone watching. Early on, I ask viewers to share the dumbest beauty hack they tried in the comments, because misery loves company. Chapter 2. The Jar. If you're picturing the jars from the internet, you'd be close. Mason jar, hand-labeled with a Sharpie that read onion juice overnight. It had condensation sometimes. Bits of onion would float, black specks like tiny promises that looked more like evidence. I harvested it like it mattered. Cutting onions at 11 p.m., squeezing them through cheesecloth, swearing at the smell, but telling myself the smell would be temporary. Smells are temporary. Problems can be scrubbed. They are wrong sometimes. The first application felt ridiculous and thrilling in equal measure. A private rebellion. A thing I did alone while Maya slept. The house dim, the TV left on for white noise. I remember the way the kitchen light threw a yellow circle across the cutting board, the way the juice pooled in the jar and sent up a scent that made my eyes water. I thought, for a moment, of the guys in the videos, men stroking their hair in slow motion. I thought about youth. I thought about a haircut I hadn't had in a year because I couldn't be bothered to call. That night, I slept like someone with a secret. I slept and rolled, and the jar sat by the sink like a small, honest thing. In the morning, the smell stuck to my hair like static cling. It was not subtle. It was not pretty. It lingered in the sheets, in the pillow, on the collar of my shirt. And because I'm an optimist by nature, I believed it would fade as I went about the day. Chapter 3. The morning she looked at me. Maya is the kind of person who notices details other people miss. The tilt of a picture frame, the way the neighbor's dog sits, the tiny paint chip on the kitchen cabinet. That morning, she noticed my hair smelled. She tried to make it gentle at first. "Do you smell?" she said, trailing off. I laughed it off, which, in hindsight, had the warmth and charm of a man putting a Band-Aid over a deep scratch. I made a joke about garlic breath and coffee. She didn't laugh. "Is that onion?" she asked, quieter. "Yeah," I said. "I read something online. It's supposed to—" "You're doing what?" Her face shifted. There was irritation, but also an undercurrent of embarrassment. She smoothed the pillowcase, an unconscious attempt to remove the trace, the mark of my night's work. The way her fingers brushed the sheet made me realize how private this had been for me, but not, apparently, private at all. The smell had already spread its small suburban invasion. I could have stopped there. I could have apologized, thrown the jar away, boiled the sheets. Instead, I half apologized. Sorry, I thought, look, it might help. The phrase, "it might help," is a tiny thing that waves the red flag of denial. It promised results that didn't exist yet. It excused behavior without acknowledging the line it crossed, the line that divided "this is mine" and "this affects you." Chapter 4. Masking and Misfires. After that morning, I entered a phase of active denial that looked a lot like creative problem-solving. I tried everything short of admitting I had made a mistake. I shampooed obsessively, turning my shower into a ritual of scrubbing. I bought the strongest men's cologne at the drugstore and doused my neck like layering paint over rust. I slept with open windows in the fall, convincing myself the draft would be a deodorizer. None of it worked. Cologne clashed with onion and made a chemical perfume that was somehow worse. The scent became an argument of molecules. There were small, comic defeats. I kissed Maya once, an impulsive, hopeful peck, and she recoiled with a face that I still see when I close my eyes. Stunned, hurt, disgusted. She said nothing at the time, but that silence was a message louder than any shout. There was a dinner at her sister's house, where an aunt leaned in and whispered, "Are you okay?" And I was suddenly aware that my personal experiment had become public property. It should have been small, a silly thing that ended in embarrassment. Instead, it felt like a crack that widened with every attempt to patch it. Every time I laughed about it to friends, Maya's smile wore thinner. She would make little jokes, too little, too sharp, and then look away as if the smell had taught her to be careful. Chapter 5. The First Real Argument. Arguments in long-term relationships are often not resolutions, they are repetitions. A small thing begets a small thing, which begets a larger thing.
We had our first real argument about the onion. Not because of the onion, but because it was the lens through which everything else was being judged. "It's not funny, Ben," she said. We were kitchen adjacent, leaning on opposite counters, the afternoon light making our coffee mugs glow. "It's not about the smell. It's about the not asking, about making a decision without me. You're always tinkering, always on some self-fix. This is the 1,000th thing where you act like the solution is something you can buy at midnight." Her words hit a place I'd been trying to ignore. I am good at projects. Give me a to-do list and I will find satisfaction in crossing things off. Walk a long distance, I will bring snacks. Need a new closet? I will build one. But relationships are not projects. They do not accept project management. My tendency to fix, to take privatized action, had been a coping mechanism for months, maybe years, ever since a different kind of grief had folded into our life. We argued about attention, about small slights. Maya spoke of dinners alone, of me checking my phone in bed, of plans quietly made without any real check-in. I listened, at first defensive, then gradually quieter, because beneath her critique was a map of all the ways I had been absent. Chapter 6. The Backstory. Why onions? Why now? If you keep a running tally of excuses, you will miss the pattern. I had a string of excuses. Longer work hours, a project that consumed my evenings, the stress that ate at my patience. But there was one event that I had been avoiding talking about, even to myself. 6 months earlier, my father died. He had been stoic and stubborn in the best ways and vanished in a hospital that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. I spent a week in motion afterward. Arrangements, calls, a funeral that felt like packing up a part of my own future. After that, the small things felt heavier. I couldn't sleep. I lost the little rituals that tethered me to normalcy. I started looking for quick fixes that could replace the conversations I wasn't ready to have. Onion juice is a ridiculous remedy to be wrestling with in the wake of grief, and I know that. Yet there was a logic to it in my head. Restore the exterior, maybe the interior would follow. My vanity was a wedge against something deeper. An attempt to prove I was still the man I used to be, or at least the man who could still care about looking like that man. Maya felt this absence as neglect. She felt it as a hollowing. She didn't accuse me of cheating or of any dramatic betrayal. She accused me of leaving her in a home where my head existed more in the glow of a phone than in any present moment. The onion jar became a symbol because it was small and ridiculous and therefore painfully easy to point at when everything else was too complex to name. Chapter 7. The Public Moments That Hurt. There are moments when embarrassment morphs into evidence. We had a friend's birthday dinner at a noisy Italian place. I had been obsessively washing my hair for 2 days before, trying to beat back the smell. It should have been fine. It wasn't. At the table, between plates of pasta, Maya's sister leaned across and said, sotto voce, "Is everything okay between you two?" Her eyes were kind but sharp. In the stall of silence, I watched Maya's face tighten, and in that tightening, something like a public indictment formed. Later that night, after the candles had gone out and the group had drifted, Maya walked me to the car and said quietly, "You know this is not just about Onion, right? You know you're hiding behind things." The phrase hit with the weight of the year we had been living. The missed doctor's appointments, the unreturned texts, the dinner plates stacked to the ceiling. The onion was a symbol, yes, but symbols have teeth. Chapter 8. The Friend Who Woke Me Up. You need a friend in moments like this who will not be poetic. Mine is Alex, my high school buddy who still texts like it's 2008 and uses more memes than sentences. He showed up to our kitchen one evening with 2 beers and a look that said he had seen worse and he was there for the sequel. "You're a walking YouTube video," he said, without judgment, which felt harsher than scolding. "Onion juice? For real? You could have bought a thoughtful thing, flowers, a ticket, something that makes her feel like you thought of her. This looks like you retreated." I defended myself, of course. We all defend ourselves when confronted. I told Alex about the videos, about the sleeplessness, about the tiny cost of hope. He listened, and then asked a question I hadn't been ready to answer. "When was the last time you asked Maya how she was without trying to fix anything?" The question landed and hung there. I found it difficult to remember a time when I had sat with her in the middle of something hard without offering a solution. I could inventory practical fixes in my head, but not moments of presence. Alex's brutal, generous truth was that my onion jar wasn't the problem, it was the symptom. He told me, gently, insistently, that if I treated everything as a problem to solve, I would never be brave enough to sit with what hurt. Chapter 9. Small Repairs That Failed. Once you see the structural issue, it's tempting to perform the small, visible repairs and call it progress. That week became a montage of my apologies that looked like errands. I bought new pillowcases and scrubbed the sheets until they smelled like detergent. I took the jar and stashed it in the trash. But when Maya didn't find it, when she didn't even notice, I realized how little stagecraft mattered if the emotion behind it was missing. I tried to be better at small things that seemed safe. I cooked dinner, I put my phone in the drawer during a movie, I set a timer for us time, an hour with no devices. At first, these felt like real, tangible changes. But the onion kept working as evidence. The smell would appear at odd moments, clinging to a jacket, to a sweater. We would have a good evening, then a text would come through and the thread would snap. That's the cruel thing about patterns. They don't care about proofs. They live on repetition. Then came the night that I realized something scarier was happening. Maya had been quieter for days, and she finally sat me down on the couch like a person who had practiced the calmness it takes to say dangerous things. She spoke slowly, measured, and when she finished, there was a bag on the floor next to her feet. "I need space," she said. Chapter 10. The Ultimatum Builds. Ultimatums have a bad name. They are often painted as manipulative or destructive, but sometimes they are a desperate attempt to create a boundary that has been ignored. Maya's bag contained a few things: clothes, a toothbrush, her laptop. It wasn't theatrical, it was practical. She had a taxi app open. The light from her phone made a rectangle on the carpet that felt like an accusation and a map. "I'm not doing this forever," she said. "I can't keep living like a roommate with someone who's checked out. Come with me if you want. We can figure out logistics together. Or don't. But I'm not waiting for a man who won't look up from his projects when I need him." The calm of her voice made it worse. Calm is the sound of someone who has rehearsed leaving. My mind went into the old modes of bargaining. I offered to go to therapy. I promised to stop the stupid things. I said the words I thought she wanted. But the promise felt less like a pledge and more like a plea for more time. Time was what had been spent. At one point, she said, "This is not about the jar." And I believed her. It's about whether you can choose us when it's inconvenient. It's about whether you will ask me to be part of the solution before deciding on the solution yourself. There was a tense beat, the kind that movies slow down. The taxi arriving, a neighbor's dog barking, the sound of the apartment whooshing with the difference of an almost empty adult life. I reached across the couch to take her hand and felt simultaneously like I was grabbing for a lifeline and like I was coming up against a shield she had built. Chapter 11: The Mediator That Wasn't a Courtroom. Maya suggested talking to someone neutral, a mediator of sorts. Not a lawyer. She didn't want legal theatrics. She wanted a person who could help us speak in ways that didn't dissolve into the same old trenches. She proposed a counselor, a practical step. She even texted a friend who recommended someone. That night, we sat at the kitchen table with the counselor's name between us on my phone. I could see in Maya's posture that this was a step toward clarity. For the first time in months, we were speaking about the future conversely. What actions would look like, what changes were necessary.
It felt like a courtroom in miniature. Statements, evidence, plans, and for the first time I felt the weight of accountability in a way that didn't let me be smug about a jar. But accountability is heavy. It requires admission. I couldn't get past the part where I wanted the onion jar to be the argument. Because if the onion jar were the argument, my solution would be simple. Throw it away, scent the house, apologize performatively. If the onion jar was only the symptom, then the work became about schedule changes, therapy appointments, rewiring habits that had become my default. That is the harder, slower work, not sexy, not instant. Chapter 12: The Midnight Pour. That night, after Maya had packed the toothbrush into the bag and the apartment hummed with the potential of absence, I did one quietly decisive thing. I walked into the kitchen with the jar, uncapped it, and poured the rest of it into the sink. It sounds symbolic, and it was, but symbols can be both performance and truth. I felt my hands shake a little. The onion juice ran like dark oil down the drains, and I watched each drop swirl away. I thought, briefly, that watching it vanish was like watching an excuse drain out of me. I flushed the cheesecloth and scrubbed the jar until it looked like something that had never contained anything at all. I thought throwing out the jar might make the problem disappear. Of course it didn't. By morning, the smell was still not entirely gone. The sheets still held a trace. More importantly, the thing that had driven me to the jar, the distance I had been maintaining, remained. When Maya left that night, she didn't slam a door. She kissed me with a tenderness that felt like a test and walked out into the hall carrying the small rectangle of her life. The taxi waited outside. I followed to the doorway because men follow when frightened. From the building steps, I watched her get in, watched the car pull away. The city lights blurred, and the night sounded larger than it had before. I stood there with an absence that was not dramatic, no shouting, no spectacle. Just the quiet weight of someone choosing to leave. It felt like a verdict, even without a judge. Chapter 13: A Moment of Clarity That Is Also a Mess. After Maya left, the apartment felt like a stage set. I had no audience but the things I had left behind. 2 mugs, a jacket, a photograph of us in a cheap frame. I moved through the rooms as if I were trying to find an instruction manual. They list steps for assembling a bookshelf. They don't list steps for putting a relationship back together. I called Alex at 1 a.m. He picked up like a man who knew the length of my vices. "You poured it out?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "and it didn't fix anything." "Well, it's a start," he said. He was right in the literal sense. It was a start, and also nothing. He asked me if I would go to therapy, not as a code for weakness, but as a literal question. Would I commit to someone else telling me things I didn't want to hear? Would I show up to the tiny, degrading stuff that real change requires? I said yes loudly enough to make a promise, but promises in my mouth have been cheap things lately. The only way to make them real was to show up. So I booked an appointment. It was the kind of small, practical, humiliating thing that felt like a humble pie. The counselor's schedule had a small opening in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, a length of time that feels both immediate and vast. 2 weeks in which Mara might choose to come back, or she might not. I had started a plan. I had not finished it. Chapter 14. The night before the hearing. The next days were a terrifying mixture of rehearsal and panic. I practiced apologies in the mirror and then recoiled from my own voice. I washed the house obsessively. I wrote out things I needed to say and then tore the paper into small strips because saying them aloud felt like a performance I didn't trust. I called Maya's mom once to ask if she was all right, and she said in a voice like warm bread that Maya needed space. The day crept towards something that felt like a hearing, a moment where all our small failures and quiet resentments would be laid bare. At some point in the quiet, I sat on the floor of the bedroom and flipped through a photo album of us at silly places, State Fair, a camping trip with 2 burnt marshmallows, and I felt the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. A jar of onion juice, in the end, had lit up all the places I had been absent, but knowing that did not lessen the fear. Awareness is a beginning and not a cure. Chapter 15. The Threshold. On the morning that could have been either a reunion or an ending, I stood at the threshold of the living room and watched the light hit the couch where she had sat, where she had last looked at me with a softness I was afraid of losing. I felt every stupid thing I had done with the clarity of hindsight, and I hated myself a little for the absurdity of it. A man who poured juice into his hair to feel younger and lost something that required him to feel older. There was a key difference between the way movies stage these things and the way they happen in real life. In movies, there is often a dramatic reconciliation or a dramatic exit with a suitcase. In reality, the space between the two is filled with small logistics, silence, and the slow, grinding work of truth-telling. I had to be honest, not perform honesty, not craft it for sympathy, and that was terrifying. Being honest meant naming grief. It meant saying I had been running from it. It meant admitting that I had been using the ritual of self-improvement to avoid a conversation I didn't know how to have.
And so I did something that feels small and enormous. I sat down with my phone and opened a note app and typed a single sentence I could not say out loud yet. I used vanity to avoid losing you. When I looked at that sentence, it felt like a live wire. It was the truth, and truth can be the most dangerous thing because it demands action. Chapter 16. The Cliff. Maya texted, "Should we meet at the cafe on 3rd at noon?" She used that neutral proposal as if to allow for anything to happen. Reconciliation, a steady cock, the next steps, the refusal. I put on shoes that felt too big for my feet and left the jar in the trash where it would be forgotten by the city and not by me. The noon hour felt both too fast and too slow. On the walk to the cafe, I rehearsed. I practiced not being defensive. I imagined apologizing with small gestures that were real, listening instead of explaining, acknowledging instead of solving. My stomach felt hollowed. The city smelled of rain and street vendors. The world went on in the way it always does when your interior life feels like a compacted storm. I haven't told you everything that happens when 2 people who love each other have to decide whether to stay. I haven't described the words she said at the cafe or the way the barista took extra care with our coffees as if tending to something fragile. I haven't told you the full, raw exchange where she put her hands on the table and said plainly, "I can't be the person you call when things are broken and expect me to accept Band-Aids." What I will say is this. There is a point where the scent of something silly becomes a sign of much larger decay. There is a moment when the closet of small lies opens and everything falls out. And there is a second where, if you are lucky, someone will tell you exactly what they need in the simple terms you can act on. The cafe clock ticked louder than it had any right to. My mouth felt full of apology and fear. When she got to the line about time and boundaries, my legs shook. She said she loved me, and that was not a contradiction. It was the reason why she could be decisive. Love, she seemed to say, sometimes looks like walking away. And then, right there, in that hum of milk steaming and cups clinking, Maya stood, gathered her bag, and gave me an ultimatum that sounded less like a legal threat and more like a plea for sanity. She asked me to make a plan that included real, sustained action, not just performative scrubbing and midnight rituals. She asked for therapy and attendance and a timeline of accountability. She asked for us to be put at the beginning of a list that I had long treated as an optional item. I reached across and took her hand. The grips of our palms felt familiar and fragile. I promised the obvious and the hard, to show up, to stop treating us like a project, to sit with what hurt instead of inventing solutions. She nodded, but her face said that words were not enough.
We left the cafe without deciding everything. We left with more questions than answers. I drove home thinking of the jar in the trash and the way the drain had swallowed the onion juice like a small confession. I parked the car, unlocked the apartment, and for the first time in months, I sat in silence and let the emptiness be. This is where the first part of the story stops, where the narrative hangs like the smell of something that has yet to be fully erased. I stood in that silence, aware of the choices ahead, aware that pride and vanity had led me here, and aware that any rescue required me to change more than my hair. Chapter 17. The First Session. The counselor's office smelled like clean linen and no judgment. It was a small room with 2 armchairs, a plant that had probably seen worse couples than us, and a stack of pamphlets arranged like good intentions. When Maya and I sat down across from Dr. Rivera, I felt the same odd mixture of exposure and relief that comes from stepping into a room where someone else holds the stopwatch on your mistakes. Dr. Rivera spoke slowly, the way people do when they're used to translating ache into language. "Tell me what brought you here," she said, and because I had rehearsed versions of that answer in mirrors and coffee shops, I started with the onion jar. It felt safe to begin with the ridiculous. It was, frankly, easier than saying, "I didn't know how to stay." Maya's eyes were steady. That steadiness made me answer honestly in a way I hadn't in a long time. I told Dr. Rivera about the videos, the late-night ritual, the smell that wouldn't leave. I confessed how absurd it felt to be made vulnerable by something so small. "And when did the smell stop being just a smell?" Dr. Rivera asked. "About the 3rd time she recoiled," I said, which made a tiny laugh bubble out of all of us. But the laugh had an edge. Maya's jaw tightened, and the counselor let the silence do its work. She asked questions I hadn't allowed myself to hear. When did you stop telling her things because you were protecting her from your grief? When did you start defaulting to fixes rather than conversations? What was it like for you the week after your father died? That last one landed like a bell. I had not, until that moment, said the words out loud in front of another person, a kind of omission that felt cowardly now. I told the room about sterile hospital hallways and the way decisions fell only partially finished. I said I had been afraid to talk about the way his absence made me smaller. I said, with a kind of shame, that I had tried to look like the man who could still show up simply by looking like him. Dr. Rivera didn't flinch. She nodded and translated my accounts into another frame. "You used a ritual to avoid grief," she said. "You chose activity over conversation. You were present in doing, not in being." Hearing the clinical turn of my messy life was oddly clarifying. It gave me a name for the pattern, and therefore a place to start changing it. Maya spoke then, not in accusation, but in a recounting that read like an inventory of hurt. She told the counselor about the nights she had come back to an empty routine. She spoke of tiny insults, texts left unread, plans postponed, promises that felt performative. She spoke of small kindnesses turned brittle. I listened, and the truth of it burned me in a clean way I hadn't expected. To hear her say what was wrong and to not interrupt felt like the first honest labor of repair. Dr. Rivera suggested a plan, weekly sessions, a commitment to listening practice between us, and a check-in sheet, small, concrete things that could be measured. The idea of a therapy homework sheet made my chest tighten, but in a good way.
I am a person who does lists well. Chapter 18: Small Acts, Big Weight. The following weeks were a montage of gestures that felt at once silly and pivotal. The first Tuesday after therapy, I left my phone in a kitchen drawer and made pancakes with a reckless focus on temperature. We ate them together without screens. Maya smiled in a way that felt like a small official reopening. After we ate, we sat on the couch and I listened while she told me about an awkward meeting at work. I didn't solve anything, I didn't offer a fix. I just listened and asked one or two questions and then sat with the silence that followed, not fleeing into an action. We started a ritual Dr. Rivera recommended, the check-in. 10 minutes a day, not negotiable, where we would tell each other one thing that had gone well and one thing that had felt off. The first week, the check-ins were clumsy, awkward stumbles into the new space of vulnerability. But with each session, they grew less like homework and more like a thread. We began to trace the contours of each other's days. I learned to notice without being theatrical. I learned to put my hand on the small of Maya's back when she reached for something in the kitchen, not as a move to fix, but as a presence. I started bringing home flowers that weren't grand gestures, wildflowers, an apology in colors. I stopped timing my self-improvement in midnight hacks and started scheduling the boring steady acts, making her coffee sometimes, instead of merely reminding her to take hers, folding the laundry without making a comment about how I was helping. There were failures, small ones that feel catastrophic in the moment. I would slip, a text that took priority, a missed call, a night where I reverted to old patterns of retreat, headphones on, absorbed in work. Each time Maya called me out, sometimes gently, sometimes with that hard-edged disappointment, I tried to take the hit rather than deflect. Taking the hit meant apologizing without a string of defenses. It meant acknowledging the flaw and then stating a specific next step. It felt like learning to walk again after a fall. Chapter 19: The Smell That Wouldn't Let Go. Even as we did the daily, slow work, the onion smell became a stubborn antagonist. It clung to clothes and memory. There was a time when smell meant nothing, just another sensory note, but now it signified all the ways I had been absent. We bought a new set of pillowcases. We aired out the apartment on Sunday mornings until the place smelled like detergent and sunlight. I invested in better shampoo and a new pillow. But more importantly, I invested in a ritual, washing our sheets together on Saturday mornings, a chore that had become a small service. One night, months in, Maya laughed and told me she could still catch a faint memory of onion whenever she passed my coat. The admission was not blame so much as a cautious test. Could I hear it without making it an argument? I said yes, and then I did something that felt like an offering. I took the coat, put it in a bag with baking soda, and let it sit overnight. The next morning, the coat smelled like fresh air, and she said, with a small smile, "Thank you for seeing that." It is absurd, perhaps, that a smell could be a battleground, but human beings assign meaning to strange things. The smell had been the visible symptom, but it had also become a weather report, indicating the climate of our home. Changing that climate required effort and commitment. I learned this in the repetition of domestic acts, the ones that don't look heroic in movies, but that add up in slow, relentless ways. Chapter 20: A Slip and a Lesson. There was a night I think about often, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it felt like the moment I almost blew everything up again. We were hosting a small dinner for friends. I had been doing well, a week of consistent check-ins, a thoughtful text here and there, but old habits are persistent. Halfway through the evening, a work email buzzed on my phone. I told myself I would just glance, that it would be harmless. The glance turned into typing, then into a 10-minute absence. Maya's face tightened across the table. It was an old symptom that I thought we'd closed. Later, after our friends left and the apartment settled into that domestic hush, she said, "I thought we were past this." Her voice was quiet, but the implication heavy. I felt shame bubbling up, because I had undermined the small trust we had been building. I apologized. I deleted the email and put the laptop away. Then I did something more.
I wrote an agreement on a small piece of paper and taped it inside the kitchen cabinet where the mugs lived. It was simple and humiliating. No phones during dinner. One work check per night before 8 p.m. If urgent, call twice. It was not revolutionary, but it was a visible commitment. And for both of us, the visibility mattered. Chapter 21. Therapy Gets Real. Therapy began to move from the practical to the tremulous.
In a session that felt like an excavation, Dr. Rivera asked me to speak directly to Maya about one memory that had been hard since my father's death. I had never spoken about that night in the hospital, the way the machines had looked like a lit skyline, the way my father had squeezed my hand with a strength I had never seen him show me before, the promise we had half said about traditions to come, and the heavy, numb aftertaste of things left unsaid. I told the story clumsily, stopping and starting, my voice thick. Maya listened, eyes wet. When I finished, she took my hand and said, "Thank you for telling me. I wish you had told me before, but I hear you now." Hearing her say that felt like a hand on the raw place. It didn't fix the months I had been absent, but it was an opening. That session shifted something in the way conversation worked between us. Where before there would be small silences that grew into distances, now when one of us trailed off, it became an invitation rather than an omission. We practiced naming things, fear, grief, boredom, out loud. And when it became too much, we would stop the exercise and make tea. It was therapeutic practicality. Be brave, then rest. Chapter 22. The high-drama gesture that felt right. Part of the redemption arc people expect in stories is a big gesture. I almost resented the expectation until one afternoon I realized that a big gesture could be a sacrament if it was honest. On a gray Saturday, I drove to a thrift store and found an old cassette tape player, the kind that wobbled on its feet and made the music feel tactile. My father had loved old songs. He kept a cassette of a band we both liked in the glove compartment of his truck for years. I found a copy and brought it home. I cleaned the tape player until it gleamed, and then I set it on the kitchen table. When Maya came in, I handed her the cassette and said, "I thought we could listen. For him. For us." It was sentimental and a little ridiculous, but she laughed and then cried, and then we sat on the floor like teenagers and let the music fill the apartment. For an hour, we were not therapists, not project managers, not people on a mission to fix. We were two people holding the same memory. The gesture didn't erase months of absence, but it opened a doorway. Later that evening, I sat down and wrote a letter to Maya, not a list of promises, but a map of what I had done wrong and what I intended to do differently. I typed it slowly, refusing to let excuses slip between the lines. When she read it, she hugged me in a way that felt like a reconciliation, not a conclusion, a beginning of new work. Chapter 23. The almost returns softened. There are moments in repair when the past resurfaces, asking its old questions. Weeks after the tape player, the issue of presence rose again, not because of a new sin, but because trust is a thing that decays without small, repeated acts of fidelity.
Maya had planned a weekend trip to her sister's cabin and asked if I could leave the city with her. I wanted to be present. I wanted to show up. But the project I had promised not to let overrun our lives, work, was at a crucial juncture, and I chose to check in one last time before leaving. The air between us was thin that night. When we got to the cabin, the first evening should have been easy. Fire, wine, the kind of simple domestic joy that makes you forget the stakes of cities. Instead, we argued. It wasn't loud. It was the low, simmering kind that matters more because it is persistent. She said, "I don't want renovations in the timeline of our life." I heard the sentence as a plea for prioritization, and I answered with an apology and a concrete plan. I would block my calendar for the next month to be present on weekends, and I would hand over one small administrative duty to her that I had been monopolizing to prove I could still be useful. The cabin breath, pine, damp earth, cigarette ash from an old neighbor, did its work. We walked and then sat on the log. and I told her about my father on the night he died in a way I hadn't before. Not as a litany, but as ordinary memory. She held my hand. We did not promise a complete fix. We promised to try again. Chapter 24. The Test of Friends. Repair demands witnesses, not so that people can judge, but so the repaired truth has to hold up in the world. We were invited to a barbecue at a mutual friend's house. This was the test that both thrilled and terrified me because social settings had been dangerous during the Onion epoch, places where old missteps might be unearthed and where the audience could make mockery of private sorrow. We went together, and for the first time in months, we moved through the afternoon with a steadiness that felt earned. I engaged with friends without clinging to my phone. Maya laughed at things I hadn't known she found funny. There was one moment where an old friend, Laura, joked about my earlier obsession with weird guys' remedies. I braced for the old reflex, the instinct to laugh it off or to hide. Instead, I nodded and said, "Yeah, learned my lesson." It was small, but the world is mostly small acts. After the barbecue, Laura pulled Maya aside and said something I will never forget. "I can see the difference. It doesn't mean it's all fixed, but he's here." That sentence landed like a benediction. It meant that the work I was doing had external evidence. It did not mean success. It simply meant being present enough that witnesses could see the change. Chapter 25. When Progress is Messy. Months passed with no dramatic finality. The Onion jar became more of a story we could tell without flinching. It lived in our past like an embarrassing chapter in a book we're willing to read in company. We set up weekly therapy appointments, weekly date nights, and a monthly situation audit where we'd air things that felt unresolved in a calm way.
These rituals were not glamorous. They were practical scaffolding for an economy of trust. There were days I failed spectacularly. I would forget a commitment or become irritable and revert to isolation. On one such day, I snapped at Maya over something trivial. She asked me to pick up milk, and I argued about the brand. The fight escalated into sniping about larger things: time, priorities, respect. The usual pattern would have been a long, simmering silence. Instead, because we had built practice, we paused. I stepped back, took a breath, and said the two most difficult words: "You are right." That admission cooled the conversation. We did not have a Hollywood reconciliation. We had a quiet repair. We went to therapy and named the pattern, and then went home and made dinner together. That mundane sequence, apology, naming, action, started to feel like sacred work. Chapter 26. The Moment That Shaped Me. Midway through a winter afternoon, I was walking through a grocery store and found myself standing near the produce section, where the onions were displayed like a little fragrant army. My first impulse was to laugh, to remember the jar and the absurdity. But then I felt something else: gratitude. Not gratitude for the smell, but for the way that such a small, stupid thing had forced me to look up. I bought a small bunch of fresh herbs instead. When I got home, I made dinner and set the table with an attention I had not given in months. Maya came in from work and paused at the doorway, taking in the small, tidy scene. She sat, and we ate, and somewhere in the clatter of forks and warm light, I realized that the rescue had changed me more than it had changed us. I was less defensive, more willing to be present. I still missed my father. I would always carry that loss in some small way, but I had stopped hiding it behind cosmetic rituals. Chapter 27. The Conference Call and the Choice. One late spring afternoon, the work project I had been guarding finally wrapped up. Or rather, it hit a familiar impasse that could be solved only with more of the old habits. Late nights, frantic emails, the kind of heroics that make you feel alive and hollow at once. My team called for a last-minute call that night. The timing was a test. It was the same night we had scheduled a check-in date, the ritual time I promised to protect. I looked at the calendar. The instinct to be useful, to be the guy who saves the deliverable, flashed. Then I looked at Maya, preparing a salad in the kitchen,
humming an off-key song we both loved. I felt the tug of the old identity, a man who could still be useful by performing work miracles, and the pull of the new identity, a man who kept small promises and learned to be present. I told my team I would not make the call. I sent a short message. "I've got a personal commitment tonight. I'll be offline." There was a pause, a small ripple of inconvenience, and then pragmatic replies. My chest loosened.
That night, we sat on the couch, phones surrendered to a drawer, and we talked until the sky outside turned thick with stars. It was a mundane miracle, and it felt enormous. Chapter 28, The Resolution with Reason. By the time summer rolled around, the nature of our conflict had shifted. We still had disagreements, but they were less about hidden absences and more about negotiating life, vacation plans, family boundaries, finances. We had learned to handle the small stuff before it became the evidence for something larger. Our rituals were steady, and the presence of a counselor gave us a shared language for conflict resolution. One evening, as the sun bent low and golden through the blinds, Maya and I sat on the balcony with 2 glasses of wine. I asked her a question I had been nervous to ask for months. "Do you feel like we're on the other side of that agreement we made?" She took a moment, then smiled with a gravity that felt like the closing of an argument that had once been open-ended. "I feel safer," she said. "I don't think I'm done testing you. I probably will for a long time, because trust is a long lease, but I feel safer than I did last year." Hearing her say that felt like a kind of relief. Safety, not certainty, was what we were building. We were learning to tolerate ambiguity, to accept that trust accumulates through mundane things, showing up, carrying small loads, not fleeing when discomfort arrives. The onion jar, which had once been a totem of failure, now sat in my head as a relic of a particular kind of foolishness. We could tell the story now without flinching, and sometimes, in the privacy of a kitchen, we would laugh. Chapter 29, The Unwanted Congratulations. Friends and family began to notice the change. They offered congratulations in the softest possible way. "You seem happier," someone would say, or "You two are glowing." It felt strange to receive these compliments because the work of repair was private and often tedious. But it was also a balm. Outside recognition was a small confirmation that our efforts had real-world effects. One afternoon, Alex came by and ruffled my hair like he had when we were kids. "You finally stopped being ridiculous," he said, only half joking. And then he asked about therapy recommendations and how to tell a partner you were leaning into therapy. I found myself, without intending to, telling him the grammar of our repairs. Be brave, be small, be persistent. The rules were not glamorous, but they were true. Chapter 30, The Small Public Gesture. As a kind of closure, or perhaps a celebration, I planned a small public gesture that felt honest rather than performative. I organized a dinner for a few close friends and family and prepared a brief, off-the-cuff speech, not to grandstand, but to acknowledge the work publicly. I wanted the action to be a marker of accountability, a way to publicly say, "I messed up and I'm trying to be better." When I stood and spoke, I talked about the ridiculousness of a man who thought onion juice could fix what grief had hollowed out. I spoke about my father's death, the hollow months afterward, the way avoidance had looked like action. I thanked Maya in front of people for patience and for building a better normal with me. I expected embarrassment, but what I felt instead was relief. Saying the truth aloud made it less like a private indictment and more like shared history. Maya squeezed my hand during the speech. After the dinner, as plates were cleared and the apartment hummed with conversation, she leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for trying." It wasn't a finale, it was a step in the long path of living together, a small milestone. Chapter 31, The Ritual That Replaced the Jar. We created a new ritual to mark the changes. On the anniversary of the night she left for the taxi, the night that became the pivot point for us, we started making breakfast together. We called it The Morning We Choose. It was simple, pancakes or omelets, sometimes coffee, sometimes tea. We would set aside an hour and use the time to talk about things that mattered. Work frustrations, memories, dreams that did not fit into voicemail messages. The ritual was a humble liturgy for two people choosing continuity. 1 year later, I still have a quiet corner of guilt for my prior cowardice, but the ritual was a reminder. Daily decisions matter more than dramatic gestures. The onion jar had been my mistake. The breakfast was our redemption. Chapter 32, The Rescue That Rescued Me. It turned out that the rescue mission I thought I was embarking on, fixing the hair, became a far larger rescue. It rescued my capacity to be vulnerable. I had set out to change my appearance, and instead changed my life. The process transformed me in the way the transcript I once watched had suggested in other contexts. The rescuer often becomes the rescued. In trying to be someone I was not, someone whose value was measured by external things, I had been neglecting the slow, violent work of presence. In order to save what mattered, I had to be saved from my own impulses. I began in small ways to help other people. Alex asked me for advice. A neighbor confessed she was struggling to ask for help. I listened. I did not become a guru. I did not pretend my experience was universal. I simply talked about the minutiae of honesty, the kind that often gets lost in dramatic narratives. Sometimes, being honest in small places makes larger things possible. Chapter 33, The Quiet End. There was no cinematic reunion scene, no triumphal parade where we marched through the streets declaring success. Instead, there was an ordinary evening when we both paused mid-conversation, glanced at a jar of herbs on the counter, and laughed at the memory of the overnight miracle. We had both changed in small ways, and the house felt fuller for it. The smell of onion was no longer a fixture in our lives. It was part of the past. The jar that had once stood as evidence of my vanity was now a story at our table, told with humor and with a distance that suggested healing. We did not pretend everything was perfect. We never pretended that. Trust, we learned, is not binary. It is a ledger of moments that tilt the balance. We kept going. We continued therapy for months and then scaled back to check-ins. We instituted weekly chores and monthly dates. We learned to say hard things early instead of letting them calcify into resentment. Chapter 34, Epilogue, the podcast nobody asked for. In a fit of embarrassment and newfound candor, I started a small podcast with Alex where we talked about the stupid things men do to feel better and the harder things they have to do to be better. We kept it informal, mostly honest, sometimes funny. It wasn't a how-to, it was a conversation. I did this and it was dumb, followed by, then I had to do this hard thing. It attracted a modest audience, people who sent emails with stories of their own onion jars, metaphorical or literal. The messages were often messy and always human. In telling my story, I found that my mistakes could be useful without being paraded as instruction. We used the platform not to dispense quick fixes, but to normalize the work. Therapy, accountability, the long tipping of habits toward presence. If anything, the absurdity of my onion experiment made people laugh and then think. It helped some admit smaller truths in quieter contexts. Chapter 35, A Final Lesson. The thing I learned, maybe the only genuinely useful thing I hold from the whole episode, is that small choices reveal priorities. The jar, the smell, the midnight rituals, these were not the heart of the issue. The heart was that I had been avoiding being present, and while appearance can be soothing, it cannot substitute for presence. Repair is not a single dramatic act. It's a plan you keep, 1,000 times without fans. I am not a perfect man. I still have moments of selfishness. I still get tired and cranky and revert to old habits sometimes. But when I do, I notice now, and noticing allows me to choose differently. The rescue of our marriage did not make me whole, but it made me honest in ways I had eluded. We keep the jar story as an anchor, something to tell friends when we laugh about younger versions of ourselves. Now, when someone asks me how it ended, I say this: it ended with more listening than fixing.
The onion juice didn't fix my hair, and it wasn't supposed to fix my life. But the crisis it created forced an admission, and the admission was the doorway. Chapter 36. Closing. If you're watching this because you too have a jar in the closet, literal or metaphorical, maybe take it as a small, unglamorous invitation. The work is usually not about the thing itself, but about what it covers up. It's not glamorous to apologize again.
It's not exciting to go to a therapist. It's not sexy to make coffee or to fold laundry instead of answering emails, but those are the things that matter. Thank you for listening to this long, ridiculous story of how I tried to grow hair and nearly lost what mattered. If this resonated with you, if you have your own onion jar, leave a comment and share your story. If you'd like more honest, messy stories about how the small things reveal the big ones, subscribe and share this with someone who needs a reminder that repair is possible and often boring in all the best ways.